Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Kriti Gupta in Brussels, and these are the stories that set your agenda. The U.S. will provide landmines to Ukraine following President Biden's approval of long-range missiles and changes in Russia's nuclear doctrine. We're going to speak exclusively to Ukraine's ambassador to the EU this hour. Meanwhile, stocks in Asia fall as the region's tech-heavy markets stand by for Nvidia earnings later today. Will the chip powerhouse continue its remarkable AI-fueled run, or will the downside catch up? And Donald Trump's search for a Treasury secretary continues, but Howard Lutnick is out of the race as the president-elect confirms the Cantor Fitzgerald CEO as Commerce Secretary. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kriti Gupta. Welcome to Daybreak Europe. Of course, anchoring this morning from Brussels. Let's start off with a quick check on these markets here because the futures picture is maybe a little bit of a divergence from what you're seeing over in Asia. Risk sentiment certainly souring over in the Asian markets, but a different picture when you look at Euro Stoxx 50 futures higher by 0.4%. The FTSE 100 is flat. It's underperforming. So, by the way, is the S&P futures and NASDAQ 100 futures. All eyes on that Nvidia story. And in the meantime, maybe a little bit of autopilot when it comes to the equity market. In the meantime, let's also get a quick check on the cross-asset story, because here's where the U.S. politics, the geopolitics may show up just a little bit more. When you look at that 10-year yield, 4.39 is where we're at. This idea that 4.5% or 5% may be the ceiling for these yields certainly in play. This morning, a little bit of light trading, but again, anything could happen given some of the geopolitical whipsawing that we got in the last 24 hours. The currency picture is interesting as well. Euro dollar 105, just on the cusp of 106. That kind of race down to parity has slowed. That deceleration momentum has slowed. A similar story in cable as well, 126. But I would argue in the currency picture, all eyes are on dollar yen. Some calls I'm seeing this morning as high as 160, even back to 162, or at a 155 handle. And even though we are looking at that risk aversion bid, we are also keeping one eye on what happens out of the U.S. That seems to be what's driving the Japanese bond story the most. 155.23 on dollar yen. Let's go back to our top story here, which is, of course, what's happening in the war in Ukraine. Russia's war in Ukraine is escalating as the conflict passes its 1,000th day. Ukraine took advantage of its newly granted long-range missile capabilities and stuck a military base on Russia. Moscow stepped up its threat of a nuclear response to conventional attacks. A lot going on in the space. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook. Ollie, in addition to those long-range missiles, now getting approval out of the United States for landmines as well. Walk us through the strategy, walk us through the strikes by Ukraine.
Yeah, Kriti, it was a lot of news to get through yesterday, and a lot of sort of very considerable and potentially very influential news when you hear about Russia sort of renewing its nuclear doctrine. So it was sort of important to unpick this, and that's why you saw so much risk aversion sort of rip through the markets yesterday. But what we got yesterday was basically the first strikes of these ATACMS missiles by the Ukrainians within Russian territory. What is interesting about this was expected after Biden had sort of approved this from the G20 meeting to allow the Ukrainians to strike within Russia. Why it was significant is that they struck within the Bryansk region, which is not the Kursk region. And the understanding from the early reporting was that these permissions were for use within the Kursk region. So that was sort of one reason why people were sort of paying close attention to this. The second was that Putin signed into decree a new nuclear doctrine. And this I will read just sort of verbatim because it's sort of very important here. Basically saying that Russia will also view an attack on its territory by a non-nuclear state, i.e. Ukraine, that is supported by a nuclear power, in this case potentially the United States, as a joint assault. They're not going to be drawing that distinction anymore, and that those kinds of attacks would allow, from the Kremlin's new doctrine, basically a nuclear retaliation. So as you can imagine, piecing all of this together was a real sort of challenge yesterday, and for the markets, you saw again that risk aversion rip through the markets. But there's a lot of ambiguity within this, right? It's just that with this sort of groping through the darkness of war, trying to find the red lines, there was real concern that this was a meaningful step forward towards it, though the Russians were sort of downplaying the damage that these attacks actually did within Russian territory.
Escalation with a twist, Ollie, to your point. The idea here that maybe some tough language, maybe a little bit more bark than bite. Walk us through the position of some of the other allies around Ukraine. Do they share the same view, the same sentiment as the United States when it comes to these long-range missile attacks?
So, Kriti, this is where things have gotten very interesting, particularly from the sort of German perspective, because the German policy from the very beginning was they do not want to be those who sort of escalate the situation. They do not want to be sort of the main protagonists in terms of the military supply in this war. So it was always the United States that went first. We saw this with the tank question. It was before, only once the United States and Joe Biden said that they would send tanks in, that then the Germans said, okay, we will do that. That is exactly the pattern we have seen throughout this entire war over the last 2 years. That ended over the last couple of days with Chancellor Scholz saying that basically he is not comfortable furnishing the Ukrainians with long-range missiles, with these Taurus missiles. And he is not necessarily, though, in the majority view within Germany. You have the opposition candidate who is potentially, at this point, most likely to be the next chancellor, Friedrich Merz, saying that they need to be delivering these missiles. But this is also across the political spectrum. I spoke to a lawmaker yesterday, just moments after we got this news out of Putin, about what the Germans should do. Have a listen to what he had to say.
The majority of current members of parliament in Germany and even part of the German government, except Chancellor Scholz, are supportive of the delivery of the Taurus missile. We need to accept that only firmness and strength is respected ultimately by Mr. Putin. And he is testing our willingness really to be firm on the issue. And so I think we should be.
So as we count down to the election on February 23rd, this is actually potentially one of the last orders of businesses that could get before the Bundestag and could actually pass, allowing the Germans to deliver these Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians despite the Chancellor's objections.
Certainly something we're going to be keeping a close eye on. Does the tide turn outside of the United States, Germany, and some of the other allies we've got our eye on? Bloomberg's Oliver Crook reporting live out of Berlin. We thank you so much. We're, of course, going to have an exclusive interview as well on this very topic. The Ukrainian ambassador to the EU will join me in just about 30 minutes' time, coming up at 6:40 a.m. UK, 7:40 a.m. right here in Brussels. This is a crucial conversation, again, as we talk about what escalation actually looks like. It's something the markets have reacted to in the last 24 hours. Will that narrative continue? In the meantime, we've also got one eye on how the markets are reacting in Asia. Avril Hong standing by in Singapore with that story. Avril, walk us through the Asian market action.
Yeah, Kriti, certainly we're seeing Asia markets really cautious today, but maybe not so much because of developments between Russia and Ukraine, but more the anticipation of what we're going to get from Nvidia earnings. Trading volumes are about 40% lower than usual this time in the session. It's interesting to see how the CSI 300 is not faring as badly as the major benchmarks across the region, and healthcare stocks are helping to cap declines. Where we're seeing the underperformance today is out of Taiwan, and this is, of course, a market that could really use a boost from Nvidia in the sense that it's been rattled by geopolitical concerns. For the month of November, we've just been seeing those outflows accelerating. But of course, this is a market that has also run up about 20% so far this year in dollar terms. So traders might have just been choosing to lock in profits. We are seeing some reaction in the Japanese currency in terms of a bit of safe haven demand, but even that has kind of erased. We're seeing the yen at roughly the 1 week highs against the greenback at the moment. And I think this also speaks to how the currency has lost a bit of its credentials as a haven currency. Let's flip the board and take a look at some of the stocks in focus today. As I say, Taiwan is underperforming. TSMC is the big drag on the region's benchmark. But a couple of other stocks that I wanted to highlight, these two in Japan that climbed double digits. 7&I, this is of course the owner of the convenience store chain that today we're hearing from the founding family. It could take the firm private as soon as February to fend off a Canadian firm's takeover approach Tokyo Gas after the activist investor Elliott said it owns a major stake and it could come through with some important proposals. Why I'm highlighting these companies in Japan is because there seems to be a shift among investors there away from the export names in the country because they tend to do badly when the yen gains, to focus more on these individual firms. So the activism as well as the deal making, that's really what's shaking up Japan markets. Flip the board again, take a look at this chart, because as we see dollar yen, and it looks like there's a path higher, especially if you don't see any consensus about a December rate hike from the BOJ, that raises the speculation about when we see intervention from Japanese authorities. And MLive's Mark Cranfield is making the point that we're not going to see that anytime soon, because if you look at the yen on a trade-weighted basis, it's still quite far away from the July lows, so it perhaps delays any stepping in from Japanese authorities, guys.
Avril Hong out of Singapore, walking us through some of that market reaction. It's a really interesting one. Of course, we talk about not only the currency impact, but the stock market impact as well, not to mention the geopolitics. Of course, that's shaking up Japanese assets yesterday as well. But as we all kind of weigh these geopolitics, weigh this asset allocation, you can't really have that conversation without talking about Nvidia. And that's where the anticipation seems to be building up in today's trade. A little bit of flat trading when you look at futures, all ahead of their release of quarterly earnings. What will the numbers say about the state of the AI boom? A lot of folks waiting for a little bit of reality to catch up to them. Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel joining us this morning with a little bit of a breakdown. Valerie, walk us through the Nvidia story.
Critty, the anticipation is high for their results to come out later this evening around 9 p.m. UK time. If we look at what's been priced in the volatility market, these results tonight are the last big market catalyst for the year, even bigger than the December Fed meeting. That being said, there is a lot of optimism already baked in. Critty, we saw a near 5% jump in the Nvidia stock yesterday. That's its biggest jump in over 2 months on very little news. All optimism heading into the earnings results released later tonight. If we flip on and just compare the Nvidia stock to the wider chip market, again, a lot of pressure is on this stock. It is trading very close to all-time highs. You can compare that to the wider chip market, which is down some 30% since the peak in July. Now, it's not just this share price, but what the EPS growth that analysts are thinking that Nvidia can boost the market with. If you flip on and just check out the EPS growth in the wider chip market, if you strip out Nvidia, the EPS growth for the chip market is very minimal, 3.8%. You add Nvidia in, it's nearly 32%. For the wider S&P 500, Critty, Nvidia is expected to drive a quarter of the third quarter EPS growth. So a lot of pressure on these results tonight. I want to flip on and just talk about how it could be a catalyst for the wider market. We have seen some bullishness in the equity market dissipate in the last few sessions. The bullishness that came after the U.S. election result has been fading. It could be the Nvidia stock, the Nvidia results tonight that guide us in the next direction for the wider equity market.
Seeing some really big push and pulls around the tech story. And then what is the read through into the rest of the sector? You talked about it there, but some of the other chip stocks not getting on that Nvidia train. Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel joining us this morning ahead of those Nvidia earnings after the bell. I'm sure will be the top line in tomorrow's trade. But for today, feels like the markets are still searching for maybe what's happening in President Trump's cabinet. President-elect Donald Trump's search for a Secretary of Treasury is intensifying. Sources saying he scheduled interviews today with former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh and Apollo Global Management CEO Mark Rowan. Let's get a little bit more detail on some of his picks and where that conversation is going. Bloomberg's Katya Dmitrieva will join us this morning. Katya, walk us through it. How much of what's happening, the conversations you're hearing, how much of that is a signal of President-elect's policy direction?
Well, they fall exactly in line with President Trump's stated policies, at least so far. You know, the person who's going to be at the head of the Treasury, who's going to be the Treasury Secretary, will have to enforce a lot of Trump's policies as it comes to, trade or economic policies. They'll be working closely with folks on Wall Street. So this is a very high-level position. We know that one person at least was taken out of the running so far and instead was named Commerce Secretary. And that's Cantor Fitzgerald CEO Howard Lutnick, who is named to the commerce position, which is not as high stature of a position, but also will be directly responsible, under Trump at least, for things like tariffs. And what we know about Lutnick so far is that he is a China hawk, right in line with Marco Rubio and announcements like that. So he's spoken before at Trump rallies. He said that tariffs are the way to go. He's also quite skeptical of clean technology. So both of these positions, at least commerce is, we've got one more position out of the way, but Treasury Secretary still very much an open question. There's about 7 or so names that we've heard for that one.
It's fascinating that we keep expecting to get closer and closer. And Katya, to your point, we're getting farther and farther on what that secretary pick actually looks like and who it could be, not to mention the policy decisions that follow. And to add a caveat to that, how the markets react to it. I still don't know if this is bullish or bearish for the Treasury market. Bloomberg's Katya Dmitrieva giving us the breakdown of what's going on in the States. We thank you so much. A couple of other things to put on your radar for the next 24 hours. At the top of the hour, you're going to get UK CPI numbers, that inflation story, the bets around the BOE. Very very much in focus. We're looking at cable at about 126, just shy of 127. That volatility likely to show up in just about 45 minutes time. An hour after that in the UK time at 9 a.m. here in Brussels, you get the South African CPI. That carry trade that you're seeing in the South African rand very much again in focus as we look for these spots of yield. This data point might actually reflect that. And then you really have to fast forward to 9:20 p.m. UK time. It's about 10:20 p.m. right here in Brussels. Nvidia earnings, as we discussed, this could be the major market mover as we await what's going on with the Treasury Secretary pick over in the United States. A lot to digest the next 24 hours, but coming up next, we go live to Hong Kong, where pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai has taken the stand to testify for the first time in his landmark national security trial. We're going to get more on that next. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Kriti Gupta right here in Brussels. Former Hong Kong media mogul Jimmy Lai has taken the stand to defend himself against national security charges in a case being closely watched in Beijing and the West. Our China correspondent Min Min Lo joins us from outside the court. Min Min, a pleasure to have you on the program this morning. Walk us through what Jimmy Lai has said.
Good morning, Kriti. Well, Jimmy Lai came into court today looking visibly thinner, although he appeared to be in good spirits, smiling and waving at the audience as he was led in by the police. And he began giving his testimony early this morning. A couple of things that stood out to me. His remarks so far appeared to be calibrated to rebuff any allegations that he is a political radical. For example, he said that he had never advocated for the independence of Hong Kong, saying that the idea was so preposterous that he had never allowed his staff or his newspaper to mention that. His ties with foreign dignitaries also under scrutiny, including, for example, his former interactions with the former president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, for example. And Jimmy Lai said that, yes, he did ask Mike Pence to show support for Hong Kong, but he said that it would be beyond him to be able to tell the former vice president what to do. So trying to cast his interactions here as innocuous. He also denied paying anybody to influence U.S. policy on Hong Kong, saying that he made donations only to religious organizations and U.S. think tanks. And for context, he's being charged with 2 counts of colluding with foreign forces for advocating international sanctions against Hong Kong and China. He's also charged with one count of publishing seditious material for using his newspaper to get people to go out to protest against that proposed extradition bill in 2019. He also mentioned why he started Apple Daily. He said it's because he felt it reflects the core values of Hong Kong, which he said include freedom of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the pursuit of democracy, and rule of law.
Min Min, this is a fascinating time, not just for, of course, Asia and the watchers in Beijing as well, but of course here in Europe, where you have seen UK Keir Starmer, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, actually comment on this. There have been 4 British Prime Ministers since Jimmy Lai was imprisoned. He is the first to actually bring it up, not only on an international stage, but with Xi Jinping himself. Walk us through the international reaction thus far.
Yeah, as you said, the British Prime Minister raised the issue of Jimmy Lai's deteriorating health with President Xi Jinping at the sidelines of the G20 summit in Brazil. And this case is coming hot on the heels of the mass sentencing yesterday of the 45 pro-democracy activists, and that already drew condemnation from the US and Australia. You have the European Parliament as well calling for the immediate and unconditional release of Jimmy Lai. And Beijing, on the other hand, had responded to some of these Western criticisms, saying that they are trampling on the spirit of the rule of law and calling other countries not to meddle in its internal affairs. And Beijing is unlikely to bow to international pressure. And as well, this case is under scrutiny because not only is Jimmy Lai denied bail and denied a jury trial, he's being tried by 3 judges handpicked by the chief executive, John Lee. He was also denied hiring the preferred lawyer of his choice because the top British lawyer, Timothy Owen, was barred from representing him after Beijing issued the first interpretation of that national security law confirming that the power to bar such judges from such cases lie with Hong Kong's chief executive and the National Security Committee. So a lot of media attention on this case all around. Even US President-elect Donald Trump is also pledging to secure the release of Jimmy Lai as well.
A really fascinating conversation at a time when, of course, we know tensions between the two world's largest economies are very much in focus. Bloomberg's Min Lo walking us through the story of Jimmy Lai. We thank you so much. There's plenty more coming up after the break. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Kriti Gupta in Brussels this morning. Let's get to some other news stories making news around the world. A key ally of the British Prime Minister, who's tipped to become the UK's next US ambassador, has told a podcast that the UK should be prepared to use populist politician Nigel Farage as a, quote, bridgehead to working with the next U.S. president. Now, speaking to the Times newspaper's, quote, How to Win an Election podcast, Peter Mandelson also said that the UK should try and kick into touch a burgeoning feud with the billionaire Elon Musk. Speaking of Elon Musk, SpaceX says its Starship has achieved new goals during its sixth major test launch, but the company scrapped plans to catch the booster with mechanical arms. The Super Heavy rocket performed a controlled landing in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Starship capsule survived re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump was at the launch alongside SpaceX CEO Elon Musk. Now, I want to get to a bit of a corporate story that I've got my eye on. I think it really matters for the global audience. That, of course, is Walmart earnings. They reported yesterday, and this is a really interesting one. This is the major kind of American grocer, the American consumer story that's known for their kind of less expensive, value-oriented products. I'm talking about Great Value. That's their major brand. They also have kind of fuel stations throughout the rest of the country. It is a big tell on the U.S. consumer that the fact that their growth has been picking up. And ordinarily, that is a good thing from a macroeconomics perspective. But for Walmart, the history suggests that people tend to go to Walmart when their disposable income feels a little bit squeezed, a little bit of a trade down in terms of that cheaper value. So this kind of same store boost that you saw in yesterday's earnings may not be the best macroeconomic signal. I want to point out some of the other key pieces of the earnings as well, which is they also raised their outlook. Holiday season, a big boost for that. Back to school shopping, the demand story, again, that a lot of American consumers are indeed trading down. That is crucial in terms of the outlook story. But they also said the transaction growth slowed. So even though fewer people are actually buying items, the average amount that they are spending at the checkout counter has actually increased. And where has it increased? Who's the one spending this money? It's 75% of those third quarter sales came from earners making over $100,000 a year. So actually upper middle class has been contributing to the Walmart earnings, which again really emphasizes this idea that even the higher earners, the one that have a little bit more disposable income, are looking to save a little bit, are looking to pinch a few pennies, and that's why they're leaning into Walmart. At least that has been the historical norm. Nevertheless, good news for the corporate story there. Walmart, of course, a major Dow and S&P component. So certainly an important earnings consumer story that we've got our eye on. Coming up on the program, the escalating tensions between Russia and Ukraine have divided world leaders at the G20 summit. We're going to discuss this and more with the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU. An exclusive conversation in just over 10 minutes time, 6:40 a.m. in UK, 7:40 a.m. in Brussels and Berlin if you're joining us from continental Europe. Lots to discuss. The US, Russia, Germany. We'll hit it all. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Kriti Gupta in Brussels. Let's get to the stories that set your agenda. The United States will provide landmines to Ukraine following President Biden's approval of long-range missiles and changes in Russia's nuclear doctrine. We'll speak exclusively to Ukraine's ambassador to the EU shortly. And stocks in Asia fall as the region's tech-heavy markets stand by for Nvidia earnings later today. Will the chip powerhouse continue its remarkable AI-fueled run? Meanwhile, over in the States, Donald Trump's search for a Treasury secretary continues, but Howard Lutnick is out of the race, the president-elect confirming the Cantor Fitzgerald CEO as Commerce Secretary. Let's get a quick check on these markets here because, as I said, futures are maybe not necessarily following the cue of what we saw over in Asia. This idea that you are seeing green on the screen across both sides of the Atlantic. Euro Stoxx 50 futures higher by 0.6%, so gaining in just 30 minutes time from last time I checked these markets. FTSE 100 higher by 0.1%. The notable laggard there, even over in the States, you are seeing some momentum pick up, but maybe not to the extent that you are maybe expecting in Euro Stoxx 50 futures as well. Let's get a quick check on the cross-asset story because that is where I would argue most of the geopolitical Treasury action is going to be kind of concentrated. The 10-year yield at 441, higher by about 1 basis point. So again, this idea of risk-on sentiment, this kind of inflationary sentiment in the equity market, very, very lightly reflected in the bond market as well. Euro dollar at a 105 handle, cable at 126. For me, it's all about dollar yen though. As we're talking about that haven bid, as we're talking about the geopolitics, even currency intervention and what a Trump 2.0 may actually look like, 155.38 on dollar yen, higher, stronger, I should say, by 0.5%. A move, by the way, you're also seeing reflected in the Swiss franc and other haven assets around the world. In the meantime, let's get a quick check on some of this breaking news here because we are getting headlines out of the Ukrainian story. I'll start off with the U.S. Embassy in particular in Kyiv issuing a warning. It looks like they are closing their embassy of information of a potential air attack as of today. They will be closing the embassy out of an abundance of caution, saying that they, quote, received specific information of a potential significant air attack on November 20th. That is according to their website. At the same time, we're getting headlines coming out of Reuters as well that Vladimir Putin is very specifically making comments on territory, saying he's open to talks on Ukrainian ceasefire deal with Trump, but will not agree to ceding significant territory. So that is something we're going to see if we're perhaps reflecting these markets. A little bit of a boost that we're seeing in futures, a little bit of a drop that we're seeing in some of those haven assets that we were just talking about. That's going to be something we keep a very, very close eye on. Let's continue that conversation. Leaders of the world's largest economies at the G20 summit were divided on the increasing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has continued to resist sending long-range missiles to Kyiv, while French officials have been pushing a tougher stance towards Moscow. Meanwhile, Bloomberg has learned that the U.S. is going to be providing Kyiv with anti-personnel landmines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reiterated his call for peace to the European Parliament.
We must push Russia toward just peace. Every blow and every threat from Russia must be met with firm sanctions. For 1,000 days, it has been crucial to radically reduce Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook joining us out of Berlin this morning. Ollie, G20 and Ukrainian support kind of eroding there. It's maybe not as cohesive as maybe it was 6 months ago. What do you make of it?
Yeah, absolutely, Kriti. I mean, I think this has been the sort of concern for the Ukrainians since day one, which is why Volodymyr Zelensky has been so active on the international stage, really cognizant of the fact that time is on the side of Vladimir Putin. And as this war drags on and on and on, there's going to be diminished support. And we saw that basically not only from this communique of the G20, but even last year, the Ukrainian sort of that issue was sort of falling in sort of the order of sort of importance. This is all coming into sort of really sharper relief for the Europeans, for the Ukrainians, as Donald Trump heads for the White House and some of these sort of ambiguities over what he wants. I mean, these Reuters lines are very interesting about Putin saying that he's open to talking to Trump about a ceasefire, saying that Russia will not cede territory. What he means by that, by the way, is that he considers the parts that he has taken of Ukraine as Russian territory now, right? So this is the sort of grounding point where the Europeans are now considering what is it that they're opening to do? What is it that they can do to try to push back against some of this rhetoric from Putin? We heard some of these things from Joe Biden saying that basically, yes, you can strike within Russia. This is where the line has stopped, though, for the Germans. The Germans have followed in lockstep with Joe Biden and the United States throughout this entire war, saying that once the U.S. says we can deliver tanks, we, the Germans, will deliver tanks. That has been in lockstep until this question of long-range missiles. This is not the predominant view, though, across the German political establishment. Have a listen to what one lawmaker told me yesterday, just moments after Putin signed in his new decree on the nuclear doctrine.
The majority of current members of parliament in Germany and even part of the German government, except Chancellor Scholz, are supportive of the delivery of the Taurus missiles, and as a consequence of the American decisions to allow for the use of far-range missiles even to hit targets, military targets on Russian ground. I think the Taurus issue can be revised, because one of these principles of the German decision making in this context was that we indeed want to isolate. We want to be in line with our closest allies, but their position has changed. So should, I think, also the German position.
And so too has the Russian position in the last few hours. We have the decree signed by Vladimir Putin saying that basically any sort of collective attack, implying that any of these sort of assets that are used by Ukraine from the United States, from Germany, within Russian soil, would not necessarily prompt, but would justify a nuclear retaliation from Putin. That is what we just heard from the president. Does that change your opinion?
I think we have to learn that we need to be firm on the defense of the security of our continent. There is one country which is aggressive against its neighbors. There is one country which claims to acquire territories belonging to other nations against international law, and this is Russia. And it is, of course, conducting some form of psychological warfare against Europe. And of course also other things like sabotage and other actions. I think we need to be firm on that, and we need to accept that only firmness and strength is respected ultimately by Mr. Putin, and he is testing our willingness really to be firm on the issue, and so I think we should be.
So there you hear from one of the German lawmakers from the FDP, and this is a view that is held by the CDU, the FDP, and a number of other sort of political parties in Germany. What is interesting, Kriti, is as we head into this German election on February 23rd, this actually may be one of the last sort of items of business that will go through the Bundestag. They may actually vote on this and actually vote in favor of delivering Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, despite the Chancellor's objections.
And speaking of those objections, especially around those Ukrainian missiles, how does it actually translate domestically in Germany? You kind of hit on that, but Ollie, expand a little bit for us on what this actually means for aid for the war effort on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, it's worth spending a little bit of time on, because there's a little bit of nuance. Though overwhelmingly there is support for Ukraine across Germany, the support has different shades to it, right? There are those who say that Germany should have a much more active role, should be delivering more of these sort of missiles to the Ukrainians. However, on the far right and the far left, and these are huge political forces now that really came in the last few years really sort of out of nowhere, with Zara Wagenknecht on the far left and the AfD on the far right, that has been around for a little bit longer. But these are parties that are very opposed to any more sort of entanglement within Ukraine. So while most of the mainstream parties are in favor of sending some of this equipment, Scholz is sort of doing a bit of in the center. He's saying we will be there till the final days to support Ukraine, but we will not take action to sort of escalate the war. The question is for him going into this politically is, will he necessarily be the candidate for the SPD? There's a lot of questions swirling around in Germany over the last few days, where you have Olaf Scholz on the one hand, but then you have, who is not a very popular politician, and Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, who has been very, very prominent, and a lot more chatter, Kriti, going on over the last few days about potentially whether the SPD will have to replace its candidate. We should say the SPD is standing firm behind Scholz right now, but again, a couple months is a long time in politics.
It's certainly something that we're going to be keeping a very, very close eye on. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, plenty on his plate. We thank you so much for joining us out of Berlin. Perhaps something that Ollie was talking about may actually get priced into these markets, alongside, of course, all eyes on the equity story over in the States. Nvidia, the bellwether for the global AI boom, set to report quarterly earnings later tonight. If you're up at 10 p.m., tune in to those earnings. Let's bring in a little bit more with Bloomberg's Asia equities reporter, Winnie Su, joins us this morning. Winnie, walk us through the Nvidia story. What is the game changer for this earnings report?
Right, so all eyes are on Nvidia earnings right now, and I was just talking to a hedge fund manager in Singapore just now who said that this is the most important macro event that we have for the rest of the year, and just Barclays had a note yesterday saying that it's even more important than the December Fed meeting and the CPI. And the reason behind that, it's not just because it's the most valuable company in the world, but also it's the bellwether for the AI industry and for the U.S. economic health. And when we look at just the market perspective, it actually has the heaviest weighting on the S&P 500, which is, as you know, the biggest, one of the best performing markets worldwide this year. And with that 24% gains of the S&P 500, Nvidia actually contributed a quarter of those gains. So Nvidia rising 200% year to date kind of hyped up so much of the investors' expectation of what earnings delivery that we're going to be expecting. Now, with that very high expectations, looking at fifth consecutive earnings beat coming out, people are tuning into what the forward guidance might look like if they can actually meet that insane demand that quote unquote that Nvidia actually mentioned earlier, and also if there's going to be more specifics on the new product Blackwell. So that would have an impact on not just the U.S. Market, but also the Asia market as we wake up tomorrow morning.
All right, Bloomberg's Asia equities reporter Winnie Su bringing us that preview for Nvidia. We thank you so much. Of course, the other piece of the equation that we're going to keep an eye on comes in just under 30 minutes' time. Investors awaiting the UK CPI data. That'll land at 7 a.m. UK time, 8 a.m. here in Brussels. Let's bring in Bloomberg UK and European economist Anna Andrade for a little bit of a preview. Anna, what's the game changer for you on the CPI data that drops in about 20 minutes' time?
Hi, good morning. So there are not going to be a lot of great news with the upcoming CPI data. We've seen inflation sort of falling, and the October print is likely to show that trend reversing. So CPI is likely to climb a little bit above the 2% target. Now, that will mostly be driven by energy because we're going to have an update of the off-gem price cap. So energy inflation will sort of mechanically push up on the headline measure. But I would say that the game changer and the bit that I'll be looking at more closely is what's happening to services. That's where the BOE focus is. We've seen some signs of stickiness. We're actually expecting services inflation to remain unchanged at close to 5%. And that's really sort of what the BOE doesn't want to see. And it's one key reason why they have been gradual. And I think essentially they will be looking at that. And the problem, I would say, more looking into 2025 is that services inflation, the disinflation that we're likely to see will remain slow. So progress will remain slow on that. One reason is the budget. We have all these sort of business costs that are going to go up, and that will also cause inflation to fall slowly and will keep the BOE on sort of a gradual rate cut path.
All right, Bloomberg's UK and European economist Anna Andrade at the edge of her seat for this very juicy CPI report as she just laid out. We're looking at a 126 on cable at the moment. We'll see how that all pans out. Coming up on the program, we go back to our top story. The Russian war in Ukraine is escalating. The conflict now 1,000 days old. We'll be speaking exclusively to Vsevolod Chentsov, Ukraine's ambassador to the EU, as we get some headlines that the ceasefire may be open between Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. We'll bring you more on that next. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Kriti Gupta in Brussels. We've gotten headlines in this last hour reported from Reuters about the openness from Vladimir Putin about a potential ceasefire agreement, or at least discussions when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine. I'm going to quote these headlines directly. He says he's open to talks on the Ukrainian ceasefire deal with Trump, but will not agree to ceding significant territory. Again, that initially reported by Reuters. We are indeed waiting to confirm, but it's a very topical conversation given the new kind of long-range missiles that have been given from the United States to Ukraine, among several other kind of pieces of legislation out of the States, and perhaps pushback from the certain European nations. Let's get a little bit more insight here. I'm joined now for an exclusive interview with Ukraine's ambassador to the EU, Vsevolod Chentsov, joins me right here in Brussels. A pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for making the time this morning. We'll kick it off with the news here. Is this news to you, this openness that Vladimir Putin seems to be indicating to a ceasefire discussion with Donald Trump?
Well, it just proves that it was the right decision to provide Ukraine with a long-range missiles, and we've been waiting for this decision for quite long, and we want the other countries which are capable to provide Ukraine with such a support follow the suit.
There's pushback on that narrative, though, that if you were starting to see at least openness and Vladimir Putin come to the table for, again, these ceasefire talks, comments he hasn't made in a very long time. It's only seeming to come to the surface post Donald Trump's election. Is this the right time to be using those long-range missiles?
Again, we are talking about talking to Russia from the position of strength. And finally, it's happening. So you see that as soon as Ukraine is getting stronger, as soon as Ukraine could be capable to strike back, you see what's happening in Russia. So you see this development, and also what happened with this Putin's decision about changing the nuclear doctrine. It shows that it works. So if you talk to him with a position from strength, so they're more ready for a conversation.
Well, let's talk about what that conversation may actually look like, because along with those Reuters headlines, there's the argument that he's not looking to cede territory where there's already perhaps a bigger Russian influence. Where do you stand on that?
Look, we are not in the negotiation right now, and important thing is that we are prepared for any negotiations. And what we need now, we need more weapon, we need air defense. And as soon as it's happening, so we will have better chance to have a meaningful and just peace.
Let's talk about that weapon delivery. Long-range missiles is, of course, the major headline. I believe the Biden administration has also now signed off on anti-personnel landmines as well. But you're getting some very real resistance on other sorts of machinery and weapons from some of your European allies. Germany, of course, top of mind as well. How confident are you that Europe will maybe follow the American lead?
I'm sure you remember how it started from the complete no, impossible, and then maybe, and finally we start receiving tanks, F-16s, and different kinds of ammunition. And I'm sure that it's important that the first step is made, and when we push hard, we can achieve what we need.
We have a new commission here in Brussels, expected to start shortly, certainly in the new year as well. How confident are you that maybe support that Ukraine has felt in the EU, maybe in the past 2 years, will continue in this new commission?
No, we are quite confident that the new commission will stick to the same line, and the composition of the new commission, especially on important portfolios like security affairs, new position of defense commissioner, gives us quite a good signal that the policy will continue, that Ukraine will get necessary support, and we are getting support. Take, for example, the new tranche, 4 billion for Ukraine, which is coming through in the coming weeks. G7 loan, and I think this policy will continue.
Well, there is some pushback against that argument, given that more EU member states seem to be taking a more direct approach. For example, in the last couple of days, Olaf Scholz on a phone call with Vladimir Putin. How are you thinking about that? Is that a betrayal in your mind when you're lobbying for this support, this continued support from the EU and from the United States? How do you view that phone call?
Look, I don't want to comment about the substance of this call. So what is important is, actions. What is important, it's a policy. And we hope that the policy of Germany will not change, because Germany supports Ukraine a lot. And German companies like Rheinmetall, for instance, they're present in Ukraine. They produce in Ukraine, not only providing Ukraine the equipment. So yes, it's a difficult situation. So election campaign almost started. But again, we hope that there is no treason.
No change in policy, but certainly a little bit of a change in action when it comes to, even you have to admit that a phone call between Germany and Russia was not even on the table 2 years ago, even 1 year ago, even a couple of weeks ago. That was not certainly something that was even being considered. On top of that, Germany is now almost hesitating when it comes to certain weaponry, not all weaponry, but certain weaponry, the Taurus missiles, of course, coming to mind. Are you sure about that kind of closeness in policy, especially in the context of a new German election in just a couple of months?
So what is important is the substance. What kind of message is delivered? And we hope that right messages are delivered during that type of conversations. And you're right, we need more equipment, we need more components, and it's really unacceptable that we find Western components in the Russian missiles and other equipment. And we want Germany and other countries to provide not only equipment, but electronics and other necessary parts of the equipment to Ukraine, because we can produce a lot. We increased our production, comparing to the situation in 2022, 18 times. So we have a big industry, but we need support.
Do you think that support could get additional pushback from the likes of Hungary, for example? They seem to be more vocal in those EU conversations. They've objected to aid in the past. What role does that play in these goals?
Well, indeed, we managed to cooperate with the EU on defense and security issues. And our colleagues in the EU, they find a way to solve those situations. Yes, there are complications, but we're getting through.
All right. Vladimir, Ukrainian ambassador to the EU, Vsevolod Chentsov, joining me in Brussels this morning. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, as we get those headlines coming from both sides of the conflict in the war in Ukraine, not to mention the White House as well. Plenty more coming up on the show. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. All right, there's a lot going on when it comes to geopolitics, what's going on in the Middle East, Ukraine, what the markets are really sensitive to and responding. Nvidia in the next 24 hours, not to mention the Treasury Secretary as well. And that's where the chart on your screen matters quite a bit. This idea that the dollar has been on an absolute tear. Euro dollar at a 105 as a result, 126 on cable, 155 on dollar yen. This weakness that you are seeing in global currencies, no matter where you look, a function of this dollar story. But this is a chart that came from our very own Garfield Reynolds on our Markets Live blog, talking about the fact that the dollar has strengthened significantly farther than the yield premium has rose. So if the bond story was kind of driving the currency story, this chart would suggest that perhaps that has gone too far. This is going to be something we keep an eye on in terms of what that pullback looks like. Is this ultimately the Trump trade? Is this hawkishness from the Federal Reserve? Whatever it is, Garfield Reynolds suggests maybe the yield premium narrative doesn't necessarily support that dollar strength. Certainly is a conversation we're going to be continuing in the next couple of hours. The opening trade is up next. Anna Edwards, Guy Johnson will have you setting up for the opening trades in Europe. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.